Hi everyone, it's Melody here. And today I wanted to come on live and talk with you a little bit about workaholic bosses. And specifically, I want to talk about, and where I want to focus today, is what to do if you're in a position where your boss works too much and they start expecting that of you too. And so they're expecting you to be a workaholic as well. How in the world do you set boundaries? So today, what I want to do in our time together is share with you 3 actionable ways that you can define limits and push back against some of those unreasonable requests without looking lazy or making it appear like you're a slacker. So if you are joining me today live, I see Cheyenne is here. So if you are able to join live today, say hello in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if you are catching the replay, comment, like this video as well. Let me know you're here, and let's get started. So workaholic bosses. I was inspired to do this topic first and foremost by your votes that I put out here in the community, some topics I was thinking about doing. So thank you to those who participated in this. This topic today was the one that came out with the most votes. So I'm excited to talk to you about it. But it was also top of mind for me because I just finished working on an article for Courts at Work about this topic. And so I'll be able to share that with you when it's live. But in the meantime, I wanted to give you some of these tips. So let's first start by defining what I mean by a workaholic. So yes, this means working excessively. That's what we typically think of when we call someone a workaholic. But, and in fact, when there was an American psychologist, his name was Wayne Oates, and when he first coined this term workaholic about 50 years ago now, he defined it as the uncontrollable need to work incessantly. Pretty extreme, right? But workaholism is more than that. It's more about just logging long hours. What is the key differentiator between just working a lot and actually being a workaholic is what's going on inside you. So workaholics feel internal pressure and almost feel a compulsive need to work incessantly. And so it's really characterized by your own thoughts and emotions. So you have those thoughts of the internal pressure and judging yourself, a lot of negative emotions, shame, guilt if you're not working, for example, worry, fear that comes up. And so workaholism is really about what's going on in the inside as well. If you've ever worked for someone like this, then you know firsthand how difficult it can be. So maybe your boss is the first one in and they're also the last one to leave. They're in every single meeting. They're at every single event. And I think what's more common today is that they're just flooding your inbox constantly with messages or dinging you on weekends and evenings. And all of this because you want to look like a team player. You're here because you're someone who's committed to your work and you want to show that. You might model their behavior because there also might seem to be this assumed norm that that's what it takes to succeed on your team too. And for those of us here who tend to be very driven by default, this can be a really slippery slope because once we start to model a workaholic boss's behavior, it can even exaggerate that tendency we have to drive ourselves to extremes even more, right? So it's a very tricky combination. And it's pretty obvious why this would be damaging. You start to recognize that your pace is unsustainable. You're maybe logging 10-hour days. You're in back-to-back meetings without any breaks. You're skipping lunches. You're answering messages around the clock. And so it's pretty obvious how this could tax not only your career, but also your home life. So it leaves you feeling depleted, frankly. At worst, you can get burned out. And I know some of us, I definitely myself have been there. And you carry that stress home with you. It follows you home just like baggage. And it affects your energy. It affects your ability to show up and really be present with your family. So we don't want that anymore. And even though you may recognize that it's unsustainable, the pace at your work, it's scary to confront your boss. There's the fear of backlash, or you may feel like it'll be held against you. And you also don't want to look like a slacker, because you are someone who is a hard worker. You just want to do it in a more balanced way. So either way, setting boundaries is really key when you're in this situation. And I promise you that I'm going to share with you some small changes that you can make today to help you start to stand up for yourself and make changes to the way you communicate that will make a world of difference. So how exactly do you do this? The first tip, so I want to share with you 3 tips today. And the first tip is resetting expectations. So here's the thing. If you continue to ignore this problem, it's only going to stay the same or get worse. But sometimes we make passive hints at the fact that we may be too busy, we may be feeling tired, maybe our team is facing too much for us to handle, and we're not very direct about it. But it is actually possible to be both direct and respectful at the same time. And that's what I want you to do. Because passive hints will not change your boss's deeply ingrained behavior. They may have a pattern of this workaholic behavior for so many years that they may not even be aware that it's causing you consequences. So you have to communicate clearly. And when I work with coaching clients around this, I encourage them to have 2 different types of conversations. And these are inspired by the work of Michael Watkins, who is a Harvard Business School professor. And so the first of those conversations is what's called the expectations conversation. And so in order to set stronger boundaries, you first need more insight into your boss's perceptions about what you can and should get done and in what time frame. So in this expectations conversation, your goal is to ask questions like, what are a few key things I need to accomplish in the short term and the medium term? What will constitute success? What does success actually look like? How will we know when we've done our job here? By when? And how will it be measured? Is it a certain number of new clients? Is it by a certain date? Is there some sort of improvement measure that you're looking for? You need to know what success looks like and how exactly your boss is thinking it will be defined. So there's some end and not just this never-ending project. And from there, you can start to negotiate deadlines, expectations that are more attainable. And so, for example, if your boss is asking you to get a huge project done to get a huge project accomplished by the beginning of next week, don't just nod your head and say, yep, I'll get to it. That's a little bit of the people pleasing coming in, and it kind of goes against your integrity, because you may recognize that it's also completely impossible to get that done. So what should you do instead? Instead, you should explain to your boss what you'll need to drop completely or deprioritize as a result of trying to reach that unrealistic deadline. What are the consequences of that going to be? Or you can work with them to negotiate a deadline that's more attainable. And so the second type of conversation you need to have to reset your expectations is the styles conversation. And this conversation gives you the opportunity to revisit how you're interacting with your boss. And the main goal of this conversation is to pose questions like, what kinds of decisions does he or she want to be involved in? When can you make decisions independently on your own to keep things going, to keep things happening faster? How do your styles differ? And what are the implications of that for how you interact with one another? So based on your manager's responses, that's how you can start to figure out where new boundaries need to be set. And for example, let's say your boss prefers to get weekly updates face-to-face. You have a weekly 1-hour meeting where you're kind of going over what's happening. And that presents a pretty big demand on your time. So you might propose shifting from a face-to-face daily meeting to instead shifting to a weekly email update where you're giving them metrics about what happened, clear updates, and then asking them for questions and feedback where you need that. And you want to present this as what's in it for them and try to make it a win-win. So it helps you to save your time, but you also need to highlight how for your boss that helps them take things off their plate, gives them more time to focus, and make sure they're still in the loop. So it frees up bandwidth for both of your schedules. So again, if you are joining me live, please pop in the comments, say hello, and let me know if you're finding these tips helpful so far. But I'm going to move on to tip number 2. And tip number 2 is proving you've got this. And so it's really your job to show your boss that clocking 60 or 80-hour work weeks is not what makes you a good employee. It's not about the time you put in, it's about the impact you have. And so that's what makes you a top performer. And again, you want to highlight to your workaholic boss that there's another way of being, because that style of working may be so deeply ingrained and all they really know, that they've never been able to see a different model. And so you can provide that for them. So you want to show that it's about the results you can get. And sometimes people fall into excessive working habits because they're not the best at managing their time. And workaholics are actually notorious for getting caught up in busy work and really focusing on that. And if that's the case, you need to be very on top of avoiding that busy trap. And what I mean by this is it's imperative that you start looking for ways that you need to protect your time and getting better at managing your own time to the extent that you can. So that might mean taking yourself out of or actually eliminating any type of unnecessary meetings that you're in. That's always a huge time suck. Learning to delegate tasks to direct reports or placing responsibilities with other people where they may be due. And definitely learning to master the art of saying no. So going back to that people pleasing, not getting caught up in agreeing to every single request that comes your way. And so as you start to power through and accomplish your projects more efficiently, you need to make your accomplishments known. So you need to make your accomplishments visible to your boss. This goes back to emphasizing the results you were able to get and not just focusing on how many hours you poured into something. And so when you show that you're capable of execution and doing things efficiently, that's one of the best ways to gain your manager's trust and prove that you are truly capable of getting things done without having to resort to working those long hours or logging overtime. Okay, and finally, tip number 3 is all about curbing that constant communication. And one of the biggest complaints of people who work with workaholics is that expectation that they'll be constantly available. So if your boss has a tendency to send messages on evenings or weekends, you may think that typically the common advice is to ignore it. Don't answer until Monday morning. And I have a little bit of a different opinion about that. I tend to say that if it will give you peace of mind, go ahead and respond instead of going radio silent. Because sometimes if you just try to ignore it, that only amplifies your worries, your concerns about, oh my gosh, I'm not getting back to them. What are they going to think now? Maybe it's something important. I should get on top of this. And those worries you spiral out in those until it consumes all of your quality time with your family, your entire weekend. You realize you have just given up to those anxieties. So sometimes it can be helpful to just respond. But there's a certain way to do this in a very proactive way that still protects your boundaries. So let's say you get a message from your boss on a Saturday and they need some sort of update from you or they need you to get to something. Instead of just ignoring it or saying, yep, I'll get right on that, I'll have it to you in 2 hours today when I'm supposed to be off, you can acknowledge the message, let them know that you got it, confirm that gives your boss peace of mind, and let them know when you'll get to it. And so you can explain if it is something important, give them assurance that you not only got it and you'll get to it first thing on Monday. And this approach shows that you're proactive, but it also sets a clear limit that you're not going to be working off hours on your weekend. And so a quick bonus tip is keep in mind that busy periods are inevitable. Perfect work-life balance is a myth. And in order to embrace that reality, what you can do today is start to predetermine what your conditions are for compromising your boundaries when it's actually needed. Because there will come a day where it will be an all hands on deck situation, or in a lot of industries, there may be a certain time of year, season, or let's say a high profile client where it does call for you being a little more flexible with your boundaries. Because having overly rigid boundaries isn't good either. And so what you can do is today, and this is an activity I want you to work on, is start to define and consider what constitutes an emergency for you, where you're willing to negotiate those boundaries and maybe give up a little bit of that work-life balance to show and prove you're a team player and be there where you need to be. So this also goes to not every situation that someone asks you to be involved in really necessitates you being a part of it, right? So what you need to do is decide beforehand, ahead of time, when, where, and how will you compromise your boundaries, so you can be flexible when you need to and hold firm at other times when you need to. And so most importantly, when you make those types of limits, you have to follow through. Boundaries are useless if you don't actually enforce them. And if you don't enforce them consistently, it's not going to be effective if you hold to them sometimes, but then you give in at others. So make sure you've defined for yourself what those limits are and where you're willing to compromise. It can be hard. I know it can be hard, especially as someone who tends to be thoughtful and caring. It can be hard to feel like you're saying no or pushing back against someone that you respect. But I promise you that it can be done tactfully, that with some of these small tweaks to communicating more assertively, you can make big changes for the better. And so again, if you're joining me live like this, say hello if you're here. Hi, Patrick. Welcome. And of course, this entire issue of boundaries gets much more complicated when you're working for yourself, right? And you're the workaholic boss. That's live for a different day, and we can absolutely go into that. So if you'd like that, let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to hear more about, how to manage yourself. And that's all I got for you today. So if this was helpful, please make sure to like this post, comment below, let me know what you'll try today, and I will see you again soon. Bye.